The wine glass rang 3 times before the room went quiet. Gerald Vance had been tapping it with his fork the way he always did when he wanted the table to look at him. 22 people at his mother's 80th birthday dinner, and every one of them turned. Then he set down the fork, put a hand on the back of his wife's chair, and told the room he was done. He said Nora had kept his books and warmed his chair for 24 years, and that she'd be walking away with exactly what she came in with, nothing. He smiled when he said it. A few people laughed because they thought they were supposed to. Nora didn't laugh. She folded her napkin into a neat square and set it beside her plate. "You always did like an audience," she said. 6 words, quiet, and nobody at the far end even heard them. 11 days later, a lawyer would stand at that same table and read one sentence out loud, and the silence that followed would belong to Gerald. This is the story of Nora Vance. Gerald Vance was 53 years old, and he had spent most of those years being right about everything, or at least being the loudest person in the room, which he considered the same thing. He ran Vance and Sons Contracting, a mid-sized building firm just outside Dayton, Ohio, that put up strip malls and medical offices and the occasional church. He liked to tell people he'd built it with these 2 hands, and he'd hold the hands up, and people would nod. The company was worth a little over $3 million on a good year. Gerald owned all of it, or believed he did. He drove a truck he didn't need for work and wore a watch that cost more than his first house. He tipped big when people were watching and argued about the bill after they left. He and Nora had been married for nearly 24 years. She was his second wife. He introduced her, when he introduced her at all, as the one who handles the paperwork. That was closer to the truth than he understood. Because Nora didn't just keep the household books. She'd built the invoicing system the company still ran on. She'd caught the payroll error in 2011 that would have cost them a state audit. She knew where every dollar in that business had come from and where it had gone, going back further than Gerald could have guessed, because Gerald had never once cared to look. The diminishing had been slow, the way it usually is. Early on, he'd called her his secret weapon. Somewhere in the second decade, that became the one who handles the paperwork, and then it became a joke he told at parties, the one about how his wife let him think he ran things. People laughed. He laughed loudest. Nora would smile and refill someone's glass and let it pass, and Gerald took the letting pass for agreement, the way he took most silences. He had a habit she'd stopped mentioning because mentioning it only made it worse. At dinners, in front of company, he would correct her on small facts she was right about. The year they bought the cabin, the name of a subcontractor, the interest rate on a loan she had personally negotiated. He was wrong most of the time, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and that was somehow the point. The facts were never the point. What mattered was who got the last word at the table. For 24 years, that person was Gerald. He treated the marriage the way he treated the truck, comfortable, depreciating, replaceable. He'd met someone. Her name was Bree. She was 34, and she sold high-end kitchen fixtures to Gerald's subcontractors. He'd been seeing her for a little under a year. He thought he was being careful. He kept the second phone in the console of the truck, and he backed it up, out of habit, to the same family cloud account he'd set up in 2016 and forgotten the details of. He had already met with a divorce lawyer. He had already decided how this would go. He had a list in his head of everything that was his, the house, the company, the lake cabin, the accounts. Nora's name was on none of it. He was so certain of that list that he announced it at his mother's birthday. He should have read his own paperwork first. Here is the thing people kept asking afterward, the family and the neighbors and eventually a few reporters. Why was she so calm? A man humiliates you in front of 24 people and you fold your napkin and go home. Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she throw the wine? Why, in the 11 days that followed, did she never once beg? People later called it strength or dignity. Both were true enough. What actually held her still was simpler. She had already done the math. Nora Vance already knew how this ended, because Nora was the only person alive who understood how the Vance family's assets were actually held. Not how Gerald thought they were held, how they were held. She'd known for years. She'd known the night he came home in 2016 and set up the cloud backup with the password he asked her to remember for him, because he could never remember passwords. She'd known every time he'd handed her a stack of documents and said, "Just tell me where to sign." She'd known, and she had said nothing because there was nothing to say yet, and she was a patient woman by training and by grief. And there was one more thing she knew, which was the affair itself. She'd known about Bree for months, not from snooping. Nora didn't snoop. Snooping leaves fingerprints, but from the family cloud account Gerald had asked her to set up and remember the password for, the one his second phone quietly backed itself up to every night while it sat in the console of his truck. She never opened his messages. She didn't have to. She could see the account filling up with photos she hadn't taken and files she didn't recognize, and she understood the arithmetic of that too. It meant Gerald had already decided to leave. It meant the clock had started. And it meant that whenever he finally made his move, he would make it loudly and publicly and certain, because that was the only way he knew how to do anything. She simply had to be ready for the day he stood up at a table and handed her the moment. So when Gerald stood up and told the room she'd leave with nothing, Nora wasn't afraid. She was watching a man walk cheerfully toward a cliff he couldn't see, talking himself all the way there. She didn't need to fight him at that table. She needed 11 days, one phone call, and a manila folder her father had left her. She had all three. To understand the folder, you have to understand Harold Ellison. Nora's father was an estate attorney in Columbus for 39 years. He was not a warm man. He was the kind of father who taught his daughter to read a contract before she was allowed to read for pleasure, who quizzed her on joint tenancy versus tenancy in common at dinner, while other kids were learning state capitals. He had a saying he repeated so often it stopped meaning anything until later, when it meant everything. "Don't tell me what a man promises," he'd say. "Show me what he signed." Harold didn't like Gerald. He never said so directly, that wasn't his way, but he watched the man the way you watch a leak you can't yet locate. And so, in the spring of 1998, 2 years into Nora's marriage, when Gerald came to his father-in-law looking for help structuring the money to start his contracting business, Harold helped him. Harold helped him very carefully. The seed money, about $90,000, most of it from the sale of a rental property Nora's mother had left her, did not go to Gerald. It went into a trust. The Ellison Family Trust, drawn up by Harold, funded by Nora's inheritance, with Nora named as the sole trustee. The trust bought the 2-acre commercial lot on Route 4, where Gerald would eventually build the Vance & Sons yard and office. The trust, a few years later, would also take title to the house. Gerald signed all of it. He signed it fast, standing at Harold's office window, checking his watch, because there was a job site he needed to get to, and this was, as he put it, just the lawyer stuff. He signed a lease, the company leasing the Route 4 lot from the trust for $1 a year, renewable, at the trustee's discretion. He signed the deed transfer on the house in March 1998, the day before the closing, and he never noticed that the name on the receiving side was not his, and was not Gerald and Nora Vance. It was the trust. People asked Nora, later, why she stayed married to Gerald for as long as she did if she'd seen the shape of him even before her father died. It's a fair question, and the honest answer is not a flattering one about love or hope. The honest answer is that she wasn't trapped, and so she was never in a hurry. Her father had built her a floor she could not fall through. The house was safe. Her mother's money was safe. Whatever Gerald did or didn't do, whoever he saw, the ground under her life stayed exactly where Harold had put it. Security like that buys patience. She could watch instead of react. There was one conversation she thought about a lot. It was the last real one she had with her father in the hospital, near the end, when he was tired and not much interested in pretending anymore. He'd asked her, out of nowhere, if Gerald was good to her. She'd given some soft answer, the kind you give a dying man. Harold had looked at the ceiling for a while and then said, "Well, he signed what I put in front of him. That's the most useful thing he'll ever do for you." She hadn't understood it then as clearly as she did later. He wasn't being cruel. In the only language he had left, he was telling his daughter she would be all right no matter what. Harold died in 2009. He left Nora his files, his fountain pens, and one manila folder marked only with her initials, which held the originals of everything. She kept it in a fireproof box in the closet under the stairs. She'd taken it out and read it, cover to cover, exactly twice in 15 years. She read it a third time the night of the birthday dinner. Gerald moved first, and he moved the way men move when they think the game is already won. The morning after the dinner, before Nora had finished her coffee, he'd already called the bank and retitled the company operating accounts into his name alone. By noon, he'd had the locks changed at the Route 4 office. He told the office manager, a woman named Sandra who'd worked there 19 years, that Nora was no longer involved with the business and that any call from her should go straight to voicemail. Nora heard about the locks from Sandra herself, who called her cell from the parking lot, whispering, "He changed everything," Sandra said. He seemed real proud of it. Nora thanked her and told her not to worry and to keep every email, just in case. Then she drove to the office. She didn't try the new locks. She walked around to the file room window, which didn't lock and never had. She'd told Gerald to fix it for 3 years, took one thing from the cabinet, a thin folder of her own, the lease correspondence, and left. She was gone before anyone knew she'd been there. That was round 1. It resolved nothing, and Gerald counted it as a victory. Round 2 came with letterhead. 9 days after the dinner, a process server left an envelope at the house. Gerald's divorce attorney, a downtown firm with a reception desk the size of a boat, had filed. The petition listed the marital assets to be divided, the residence on Fairlawn Drive, the Vance and Sons contracting business and all its equipment, the lake cabin, 3 accounts. It proposed that Nora receive a lump sum of $40,000 and vacate the residence within 30 days. $40,000. It was almost funny. It was, to the dollar, close to what her mother's rental property had sold for in 1998, the money that had started all of it. Gerald didn't know that. Gerald had picked the number because it sounded generous to him and cost him nothing. The petition assumed in every line that the house was his to divide and the company was his to keep. It named the Route 4 property as a company asset. It did not mention a trust anywhere because the man who filed it had been handed a list by a client who had never read his own deed. Nora read the petition twice, made a pot of tea, and called a lawyer of her own, not a divorce lawyer. A trust and estates lawyer, a woman named Priya Chandra who had clerked for Harold Ellison a lifetime ago and still kept a photo of him on her shelf. "Bring me the folder," Priya said. There was a moment in those days when the whole thing nearly came apart early. Gerald got within one careful phone call of learning the truth 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and he talked himself out of it, because that was the kind of man he was. It happened because he got greedy. The divorce was going to be expensive, and he promised Bree a trip, and he decided the simplest thing was to pull some cash out of the house, take an equity line against Fairlawn Drive, which he figured was worth close to $400,000 free and clear. He walked into his own bank on a Tuesday, sat down across from a loan officer named Marcus, and asked to borrow against the house. Marcus ran the title. Then he ran it again. Then he turned the monitor a few inches and said there seemed to be an issue. The property wasn't titled to Gerald or to Gerald and Nora. It was held by something called the Ellison Family Trust, and the bank couldn't write a loan against real estate the applicant didn't legally own. Gerald was annoyed, not alarmed. He said it was my father-in-law's old tax thing from the 90s, waved his hand at it, and told Marcus to just fix the paperwork on your end. Marcus said that wasn't something he could fix. Gerald stood up, said he'd take his business elsewhere, and left. He never told his divorce lawyer. He never asked Nora. He never pulled the deed himself, which would have taken 9 minutes at the county recorder's office and would have ended the story right there in his favor, or at least without the audience. Someone who bothered to read the deed would have been saved by a moment like that. Gerald just got mad at the messenger and drove to the next bank. They told him the same thing. He decided both of them were incompetent. Round 3 was the worst one, and it happened at Sunday dinner. Gerald's family had always liked him better. He was loud and generous and easy, and Nora was quiet, and quiet reads as cold to people who mistake volume for warmth. So when the family gathered that Sunday, his sisters, his mother, a brother-in-law named Doug who sold insurance and had opinions about everyone's finances, they gathered around Gerald. Doug did most of the talking. He told Nora she was being difficult. He told her that $40,000 and a fresh start was more than fair, honestly, and that dragging this out with lawyers would only burn through money that could go to the kids' college. Though there were no kids, there had never been kids, and everyone at the table knew it. Gerald's mother, the birthday girl, patted Nora's hand and said she'd always be family, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. And then Nora's own sister, Kara, who had driven up from Cincinnati and who Nora had thought was on her side, leaned over and said it quietly, just for her. "Nora, just sign it, please, before it gets ugly." That was the moment. If Nora had a moment where the whole thing nearly tipped, it was there, with her sister's hand on her arm and the whole table looking at her like she was the problem. It would have been so easy to sign. Everyone wanted her to. Everyone was so sure. Nora looked at Kara for a long time. Then she picked up her tea, and she smiled, and she said the only thing she said all night. "It's already ugly. He just doesn't know it yet." Nobody understood what she meant. Gerald laughed and changed the subject. 2 days later, Priya Chandra called and said the documents were clean, recorded, and airtight, and asked whether Nora wanted to handle it privately or at the mediation Gerald's lawyer had already scheduled. Nora thought about the wine glass and the 3 taps and the 22 faces turning. "At the table," she said. The mediation was held in a conference room downtown, but Nora's lawyer asked that the 2 families be present, and Gerald, confident, expansive, sure this was a formality where he'd be generous and look good doing it, agreed. He liked an audience. It was the last time that would ever work in his favor. Gerald's attorney opened with the petition. The house, the business, the lake cabin, the $40,000 for Nora. He spoke for 11 minutes. Gerald leaned back in his chair with his arm over the empty seat next to him and nodded along like a man listening to his own eulogy and enjoying it. When it was Priya Chandra's turn, she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She opened a folder, Harold's folder, the originals, and she laid 3 documents on the table facing Gerald so he could read them himself: the deed to the house, the trust instrument, the lease on the Route 4 lot. Then she read one sentence aloud. It was from the trust deed, recorded in Montgomery County in March of 1998, and it said, "The real property known as 114 Fairlawn Drive, together with the commercial parcel at 4400 Route 4 and all improvements thereon, is held in trust by the Ellison Family Trust, Nora Ellison Vance as sole trustee, and no marital interest attaches." The room went quiet, not the polite kind, the wrong kind. Gerald read the sentence. Then he read it again because it hadn't gone in the first time. His lawyer read it too, and Nora watched the man's face change as he understood what his client had never told him, because his client had never known it. The house Gerald had ordered Nora to vacate was not his house. The lot his company had operated on for 24 years was not his lot. He had been leasing the ground under his own business from his own wife for $1 a year, at her discretion. And he had signed that lease himself in 1998, standing at a window, checking his watch. Everything Gerald owned, he owned inside a container that had never had his name on it. For a few seconds, nobody said anything at all. Gerald's mother, who had brought a cardigan because the conference room was cold, stopped fidgeting with the buttons. Doug, the brother-in-law, who had opinions about everyone's finances, discovered he had none about this. Kara looked at her sister and then looked away, and something crossed her face that might have been shame and might have been the beginning of understanding. Gerald's own lawyer was the first to move. He pulled the trust instrument toward himself and read it properly, line by line, the way his client never had, and Nora watched the exact moment the man realized he had walked into this room holding a petition built entirely on air. He set the document down very carefully, the way you set down something that turns out to be hot. He leaned toward Gerald and said something quiet, 2 or 3 words, and whatever it was, Gerald flinched. "That's not..." Gerald started and stopped and started again. "I built that company." "You built the company?" Priya agreed gently. "The company is yours. The equipment, the trucks, the name, the accounts. Every bit of it. My client has no claim to any of it and has never wanted one." She let that sit for a second. "But the company sits on trust land, and the lease is up for renewal in June." Nora had prepared exactly one move, and it was not the cruel one. Her lawyer confirmed later she could have terminated the lease that afternoon, put Vance and Sons on the street inside a week, or changed the locks on Fairlawn the way he had locked her out of the office. She had every legal right. She chose something quieter. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a notice, drafted by Priya, and it did 2 things. It declined to renew the Route 4 lease past its June expiration, and it gave the company 90 days from that date to vacate the trust's land. 90 days. It was, to the day, exactly 3 times the 30 days he had given her to leave the house that was never his. Gerald stared at the single sheet of paper like it might change if he looked at it long enough. He'd walked into that room believing he was the one holding all the cards, and the truth was he had never held a single one. He'd been playing a hand he'd handed to his wife in 1998 and forgotten he'd dealt. He looked up at Nora, and for the first time in 24 years he didn't have the last word ready. He didn't have any word ready. His mouth opened and nothing came, and the whole table watched the loudest man they knew discover the bottom of his own confidence. "You can't do this," he finally said. It wasn't even angry. "It was small. I already did it," Nora answered. "In 1998, you were there, you signed it." "You'll want to find a new lot," Nora said. It was the second full sentence she'd spoken to him since the birthday. "There's a good one on Webster." I looked. Then she folded her hands, the same way she'd folded the napkin, and she waited for him to understand that the audience had finally cost him something. Vance and Sons Contracting still exists. You can find it on a rented commercial lot off Webster Street, about half the size of the old yard on Route 4, with a smaller sign and 2 fewer trucks. Gerald tells people he was cheated. He tells them his ex-wife's family lawyer buried something in the paperwork back in the 90s, and that he never had a chance. Anyone who has ever signed a document without reading it tends to nod along. They understand him better than they'd like to. But there was no burial. It was all recorded, in public, in his own county, for 24 years. Anyone could have read it. He was the only one who was required to and the only one who never did. The 90 days cost him more than the ground. He had to move a working contracting yard. Equipment, material lockup, office trailer, the whole operation. In the middle of a build season, on a deadline set by the woman he told to leave with nothing. 2 of his best crew didn't make the move. They went to a competitor who had a permanent lot and didn't seem likely to lose it. The new place on Webster costs him rent every month now, real rent, to a landlord who is not his wife and does not charge $1 a year. The family came around slowly, the way families do when the loud one turns out to be wrong. Doug stopped giving Nora financial advice. Gerald's mother sent a card that Christmas that didn't say sorry but was clearly trying to. Kara called in the spring and cried on the phone and said she should have known better than to tell her own sister to sign something she hadn't read, of all the things, to a daughter of Harold Ellison. Nora told her it was fine, she mostly meant it. Bree, the kitchen fixture rep, moved on within a few months. It turned out a lot of what she'd liked about Gerald had been the yard on Route 4 and the house on Fairlawn, and neither of those had ever belonged to him. Nora still lives on Fairlawn Drive. She runs the trust quietly, the way her father ran his files, and she leases a different parcel to a young landscaping couple for $1 a year because she likes them, and they read every line before they signed. She had a fresh set of originals drawn up last year, updated and re-recorded, and she keeps them in the same fireproof box under the stairs where the old folder used to live. She has already shown the young couple where the box is, and told them why, and what her father used to say about promises. They listened. That, more than the money or the land, is what she inherited from Harold Ellison, the habit of making sure the people who deserve the floor can never be made to fall through it. Last spring, she hosted the family dinner herself, at the same long table, and most of them came because people are like that, and she let them. At the end of the night, when the plates were cleared, her sister Kara asked her the question everyone had wanted to ask for a year: why she'd stayed so calm. How she'd known. Nora didn't tap her glass, she didn't stand up, she just looked down the table, at the seat where Gerald used to sit and tell a room what was his, and she said the only thing that needed saying. My father told me, "Don't tell me what a man promises, show me what he signed," and the table, for once, was quiet the right way.